My mother cut me out of her $25 million inheritance because of who I married, so I burned her entire estate plan to the ground. Me, 38F, and my husband Dan, 40M, had been married for 12 years. We had two wonderful kids, Emma, 10F, and Jack, 8M. My parents were Karen, 65F, and Rick, 68M, a wealthy couple who had made their fortune through some smart real estate investments years ago. On the surface, my family seemed picture perfect. However, behind the scenes, there was a ton of drama and toxicity, mainly stemming from my narcissistic mother Karen. She was obsessed with money, status, and looking down on anyone she deemed beneath her. This included my husband Dan, who came from a working-class background. Despite Dan's humble roots, he worked hard and had a great career as an engineer. We lived very comfortably, but it was never enough for my mother. She constantly belittled Dan, criticizing everything from his job to his appearance to the cheap gifts he would give her for birthdays and holidays. I did my best to keep the peace and stand up for Dan, but Karen just couldn't let it go. She was determined to cause problems in our marriage. Whenever we visited her huge mansion, she would make snide remarks about our tiny home and mock Dan's frugal habits. The final straw came when my parents updated their wills. One day, Karen nonchalantly mentioned over dinner that she and my father had revised their estate plans. Apparently, the entirety of their $25 million fortune would be split between my two younger brothers, David, 35M, and Jason, 32M. I would inherit nothing. I was completely blindsided. Growing up, my parents had always promised to leave something for each of their children when they passed away. Now, thanks to my mother's hatred of Dan, my own family was being cut out completely. When I asked Karen why, she sneered, "Well, you married a penniless loser. That's the choice you made. Don't come crying to me when you end up bankrupt and miserable." I was absolutely furious. How dare my own mother disinherit me and my children over something so petty? Dan had been nothing but a good husband and provider. This was a low blow, even for Karen. I tried reasoning with her, but she was unmoved. "It's our money, and we'll do what we want with it." Maybe Dan should have tried harder to be successful instead of settling to be a working stiff his whole life. Those words conveyed so much cruelty and elitism. In that moment, I knew my mother was a toxic, terrible person. I grabbed the kids and we stormed out, though Dan tried to calm me down. Over the next few days, ISL revamped at my parents, leaving hatred-filled messages calling them out for their pettiness and cruelty. How dare they punish my innocent children over some ridiculous prejudice against their hard-working father? My dad Rick actually seemed remorseful when I ranted to him, but my mother Karen simply doubled down on her stance. Well, if Dan was man enough to actually make something of himself, this wouldn't be an issue. That arrogant, condescending attitude was the final straw. If she wanted to be cutthroat about money and inheritances, then I would fight fire with fire. I channeled my anger into researching my rights and options. I read every book and website I could find about contesting wills, inheritance laws, and limiting any other family members who could inherit in my place. What I discovered turned my frown upside down. Thanks to some handy estate laws in our state, my parents couldn't actually disinherit me so easily after all. By following a few simple legal maneuvers, I could easily claim my fair share of their estate, regardless of what their will stated. I immediately put a plan into motion to burn that smug look right off Karen's arrogant face. The first step was to sever their relationship with my children, their only grandchildren. I knew this would devastate them, as Karen constantly loved to show off Emma and Jack to her snooty friends. I bluntly informed my parents that until I received my fair share, they would be completely cut off from Emma and Jack's lives. No visits, no phone calls, no updates whatsoever. If they protested, I would seek a legal restraining order barring them from any contact. My mother was outraged, but I was firm. "You've made it clear money is more important than family. So be it. Unless that changes, you'll never see your grandkids again." Karen and Rick were besides themselves, but I held strong in cutting them off completely. Every call, email, and message went unanswered. We moved to a new place and didn't give them the address. The next part of my grand plan was to properly document every insult, wrongdoing, and instance of emotional abuse my mother had inflicted over the years. I kept meticulous records, with the goal of eventually portraying her as an unfit guardian of her estate. I also reached out to my brothers David and Jason, making them aware of the full situation. While they had inherited the full estate in the will, I informed them of my intention to pursue my fair share by any means necessary. With the evidence piling up of Karen's cruelty and negligence towards me and her grandchildren, I knew the time had come to escalate the situation legally. I met with a team of top lawyers who specialized in contesting wills and trusts. They outlined a brilliant multi-pronged strategy. First, we would file for an injunction to freeze my parents' assets and block their current estate plan from being executed. We would cite potential incompetence on their part due to age and mental infirmity. Simultaneously, we would pursue a lawsuit claiming undue influence, that my two brothers have conspired with my parents to cut me out illegally. With the evidence of abuse, we would argue this rendered the will's terms invalid. Karen and Rick were blindsided when my lawyers sprang into action with our aggressive legal strategy. Within days, a judge had approved an emergency injunction, freezing the transfer of their entire $25 million estate. We immediately filed outrageous claims of elder abuse, incompetence, and coercion by my brothers against my parents. Of course, none of this was actually true, but it didn't need to be. We just needed to cast enough doubt on my parents' mental state and the circumstances of their will. The fight was on. My parents hired a team of lawyers to fight my claims tooth and nail. But with my documentation of abuse and my brother's depositions, the case was stacking up in my favor from day one. For over a year, the legal battle raged on. Countless court hearings, bitterly contested motions, and personal attacks through the media on both sides. My parents accused me of being a greedy monster, while I claimed they were cruel and mentally unfit. Finally, with mounting court costs and indefensible evidence of my mother's unstable behavior, their lawyers advised them to settle. If they didn't, a judge would likely throw out their entire estate plan based on suspicions of coercion or incompetence. In the end, my parents were forced to agree to a completely revised estate plan, splitting their $25 million fortune equally between myself and my two brothers. Victory was mine. Of course, the settlement left my relationship with Karen and Rick permanently shattered. There was so much bitterness, deception, and hurt feelings on all sides that any reconciliation seemed impossible. While I had achieved my goal of securing my fair share for my children, it came at an incredibly high personal cost. My parents now saw me as a money-hungry betrayer, while I viewed them as toxic individuals who needed to be cut out of our lives for good. Emma and Jack were traumatized by the whole experience as well. While they didn't understand the complex legal saga, they knew there was an ugly rift in our extended family. They missed their grandparents dearly. In many ways, the destructive aftermath was Karen's fault. If she had never taken such an extreme, vindictive stance against me and my husband in the first place, none of this would have happened. Her pettiness and cruelty were the sparks that ignited the legal wildfire. My brothers also struggled with a mix of guilt and resentment. On one hand, they knew our parents' original plans to disinherit me were wrong. But on the other hand, they felt I had gone nuclear over money when calmer methods could have worked. For years afterwards, there were no family get-togethers, no holiday cards exchanged, no civility at all. We lived as isolated family clusters, a devastating outcome that could have been avoided with open minds and hearts on both sides. Even now, over a decade later, the emotional fallout from that inheritance conflict has never fully healed. While my children are now grown, they have a very strained relationship with their grandparents at best. The whole ordeal permanently poisoned the family well. Sometimes, I wonder if it was all worth it, fighting so hard for a monetary inheritance while irreparably damaging family bonds. In the end, I did ensure generational wealth for my kids, as my parents always intended. But at what greater cost? I suppose there is no perfect answer. My mother's arrogance, cruelty and prejudice against my husband were unforgivable. She forced my hand through her own reprehensible behavior, but two wrongs didn't make a right in this case. If there is any lesson to be learned, it is to solve family conflicts with empathy and wisdom, not hard-line stances and avaricious legal maneuvering. Money is nice, but loving family relationships last forever. I tragically learned that too late. Break story 2. Me, 28F, and my husband, 30M, have been together for 5 years, married for 2. We've always had a great relationship, built on mutual trust and respect. Or so I thought. My husband's family has never really been a fan of me. They come from old money and have always looked down on me for being from a middle-class background. His mother, 55F, is the epitome of a narcissistic, controlling matriarch who runs the family like her own personal fiefdom. Despite their disdain for me, I've always tried to maintain a civil relationship with them for my husband's sake. Little did I know, they had been scheming behind my back the entire time. A few months ago, my husband's grandfather passed away, leaving behind a sizable fortune. As the patriarch of the family, he had always been fair and treated everyone equally, much to the chagrin of my mother-in-law. In his will, he left a substantial inheritance to my husband and me, which we planned to use as a down payment on our first home. We were overjoyed at the prospect of finally achieving our dream of homeownership. Little did we know, my mother-in-law had other plans. One day, while sorting through some paperwork, I came across a strange document. It appeared to be a copy of my grandfather-in-law's will, but with significant discrepancies. In this version, my husband and I were completely omitted from the inheritance. Confused and concerned, I confronted my husband about it. He was just as baffled as I was, insisting that he had no knowledge of this alternate will. We decided to investigate further, and what we uncovered left us both reeling. After some digging, we discovered that my mother-in-law had hired a shady lawyer to draft a fraudulent will, cutting us out of the inheritance entirely. She had then used her influence and connections to have this fake will submitted to the probate court, effectively stealing our rightful share of the estate. The realization that my own mother-in-law had stooped so low, driven by her greed and contempt for me, was devastating. We knew we had to confront her, but we also needed concrete evidence to back up our claims. Armed with the damning paperwork, we arranged a family meeting and laid out our evidence in front of everyone. My mother-in-law, of course, denied everything, claiming that we were making unfounded accusations out of spite. The rest of the family, blinded by their loyalty to the matriarch, rallied around her, dismissing our allegations as nothing more than a desperate attempt to get our hands on the inheritance. Tensions ran high as the confrontation escalated. My husband and I were adamant that we would not let this blatant act of fraud and betrayal go unchallenged. We threatened to take legal action if the situation wasn't resolved amicably. My mother-in-law scoffed at our threats, secure in the knowledge that her wealth and influence would protect her from any real consequences. She even had the audacity to suggest that we were being greedy and ungrateful, after everything she had done for us. As the arguing grew more heated, my brother-in-law, 32M, stepped in, trying to play the peacemaker. He suggested that we all take a step back and try to find a compromise. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could he even entertain the idea of compromising with someone who had so brazenly stolen from us? It was at that moment that I realized the true depth of my in-laws' dysfunction and lack of moral compass. My husband, bless his heart, remained steadfast in his support of me. He refused to back down, stating that his grandfather's wishes should be respected and that we would not be intimidated into giving up our rightful inheritance. This only seemed to enrage my mother-in-law further. She hurled insults at me, calling me a gold digger and accusing me of manipulating her son against his own family. The gloves were off, and the once civil family meeting had devolved into a full-blown shouting match. As the confrontation reached its boiling point, my mother-in-law issued an ultimatum: either we dropped our claims to the inheritance or she would disinherit my husband entirely, cutting him off from the family fortune. It was a low blow, but one that didn't surprise me coming from her. My husband, however, was visibly shaken by his mother's threat. For a moment, I could see the internal conflict playing out on his face as he grappled with the choice between his family's wealth and doing the right thing. In the end, my husband's moral compass won out. He looked his mother square in the eye and told her that he would not be party to her deceit any longer. If that meant losing his inheritance, so be it. He would not trade his integrity for money. My mother-in-law was livid. She stormed out of the room, vowing to make us pay for our betrayal. The rest of the family followed suit, leaving us standing there, feeling equal parts vindicated and devastated. In the weeks that followed, my mother-in-law made good on her threat. She used her considerable resources to wage a campaign of harassment and intimidation against us. Lawyers were hired to tie us up in endless legal battles. Our reputations were smeared through vicious rumors and lies. Even our personal lives weren't off limits, as she tried to turn our friends and colleagues against us. It was a nightmare, but we refused to back down. We knew we were in the right, and we were determined to see justice done, no matter the cost. After months of legal wrangling, the case finally went to court. Our lawyers presented a mountain of evidence, including the forged will and documentation of my mother-in-law's shady dealings. In the end, the judge ruled in our favor, declaring the fraudulent will invalid and restoring our rightful inheritance. It was a victory, but one that felt hollow in the face of the emotional toll the ordeal had taken on us. While we had won the legal battle, the war with my in-laws was far from over. My mother-in-law, enraged by the court's decision, doubled down on her efforts to make our lives miserable. She used her wealth and connections to launch a vicious smear campaign against us, painting us as greedy opportunists who had stolen from our own family. The relentless harassment and public shaming took a heavy toll on our mental health and personal relationships. In the aftermath of the legal battle, our once happy marriage began to crumble under the weight of the emotional trauma we had endured. The constant stress and strain drove a wedge between us, and we found ourselves growing increasingly distant from one another. My husband, torn between his loyalty to me and the guilt of betraying his family, descended into a spiral of depression and anxiety. I did my best to support him, but the damage had been done. Our relationship, once rock solid, was hanging by a thread. In the end, we emerged victorious in our legal battle, but at what cost? The inheritance that had once represented our dreams of a happy future now felt like a curse, forever tainted by the betrayal and heartache we had endured. As I look back on that tumultuous period, I can't help but wonder if it was all worth it. Were a few $1,000,000 truly worth sacrificing the relationships and emotional well-being of those involved? I suppose only time will tell if we can ever truly heal from the wounds inflicted by my husband's toxic family. One thing is certain, though, money can indeed corrupt even the closest of bonds, and the scars it leaves behind may never fully heal.